The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling New York streets as the production team of The View prepared for what they thought would be just another episode. Little did they know that this particular Thursday would become one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. Behind the scenes, the staff hurried about with their usual pre-show rituals. Microphones were checked, lighting adjusted, and the audience was being seated in the studio. The energy buzzed with anticipation, as it always did before a live broadcast, but today carried something extra in the air, perhaps because of the caliber of guests scheduled to appear. Robert De Niro had arrived earlier than expected. At 81, the legendary actor still commanded attention whenever he entered a room. He nodded politely to the production assistants who guided him to his dressing room, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses despite being indoors. The staff noticed he seemed tense, his shoulders rigid as he walked down the corridor. "Coffee, Mr. De Niro," offered a young production assistant. "Black, 2 sugars," he replied without looking up from his phone. In another part of the building, the show's producer paced nervously. They had just received word that their second guest, Clint Eastwood, had also arrived early. At 94, Eastwood rarely made television appearances anymore, which made today's booking something of a coup for the show. What made it even more noteworthy was that both Hollywood legends would be on the same stage, a rare occurrence given their different political leanings in recent years. "Are they both here already?" asked the head producer, running her fingers through her hair. "They weren't supposed to cross paths before the segment. De Niro's in dressing room 3, and we've put Mr. Eastwood in dressing room 7, opposite ends of the hallway," replied her assistant. "Good. Keep it that way." The caution wasn't without reason. Over the past decade, both actors had become increasingly vocal about their political views, which stood in stark contrast to each other. De Niro had been openly critical of conservative policies, while Eastwood had famously addressed an empty chair representing Barack Obama at the 2012 Republican National Convention. Their ideological differences had never resulted in a direct confrontation, but the show's producers weren't taking any chances. The regular hosts of The View gathered in the green room, reviewing their question cards and discussing how to navigate potential tension between their high-profile guests. "Remember, we want to focus on their careers, the new projects they're promoting," said the senior host. "Let's avoid politics unless they bring it up themselves." "That's going to be nearly impossible," replied another host, shaking her head. "Have you seen De Niro's latest interviews? He can't go 5 minutes without mentioning politics. And Eastwood might be quieter about it these days, but he doesn't back down when pushed," added a third. "This could get explosive if we're not careful." In dressing room 3, De Niro sat alone, reviewing some notes he'd prepared. Despite his decades in the business, he still approached every appearance with the same professionalism that had earned him his reputation. Today, however, his mind seemed elsewhere. He'd heard that Eastwood would be on the same show, though they weren't scheduled to appear together. The thought made him uneasy. Their relationship had always been one of distant professional respect. Two titans of American cinema, who had forged very different paths both on and off the screen. They had never worked together directly, their acting styles as different as their worldviews. Where De Niro was known for his intense method acting and complete transformation into characters, Eastwood's approach was more economical, understated. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. 15 minutes. "Mr. De Niro," called a voice down the hall. Clint Eastwood sat motionless in his chair, eyes closed but not sleeping. Those who didn't know him might have mistaken his stillness for fatigue, a reasonable assumption for someone in their 90s. But those familiar with Eastwood recognized this as his way of centering himself before any public appearance. His longtime assistant stood quietly in the corner, having learned over years of service when to speak and when to maintain silence. When Eastwood finally opened his eyes, his gaze was sharp and clear. "They've got De Niro here today, too," he said. More statement than question. "Yes, sir. Different segment, though." Eastwood nodded slowly. "Been a while since I've seen Bob." Neither man had planned to cross paths that day. The producers had carefully scheduled their appearances with a buffer between them. De Niro would be on first, discussing his latest directorial project, a political documentary that had already generated controversy. Eastwood would follow in the next hour, promoting a book about his life in film. But live television has a way of disrupting even the most carefully laid plans. De Niro's segment began smoothly enough. The audience welcomed him with enthusiastic applause, and the hosts guided the conversation toward his new documentary. For the first 10 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. This documentary really explores the division in our country, De Niro explained, leaning forward in his chair. We're at a crossroads right now, and I wanted to examine how we got here. The hosts nodded encouragingly, but one decided to push further. Some critics have said your film presents only one perspective. How do you respond to that? De Niro's expression hardened slightly. Look, there aren't two sides to every story when one side is clearly wrong. Some perspectives don't deserve equal time, especially when they're harmful to our democracy. In the green room, where he'd been brought early due to a scheduling mix-up, Clint Eastwood watched the monitor with narrowed eyes. He hadn't intended to watch De Niro's segment, but now found himself unable to look away. The production assistant assigned to him shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Would you like me to change the channel, Mr. Eastwood? She offered. No, he replied, his voice low and measured. I want to hear what he has to say. Back on stage, De Niro was growing more animated as the conversation turned increasingly political. Artists have a responsibility to speak up, he continued, his voice rising slightly. When we see something wrong happening in our country, we can't just stay quiet. That's why I made this film. People like Eastwood might disagree. One of the hosts interrupted quickly. Speaking of Clint Eastwood, he'll be joining us later today. Have you two ever worked together? It was a transparent attempt to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but De Niro wasn't finished. No, we haven't, and probably never will. We see the world very differently. I respect him as a filmmaker, but some of the things he supported over the years... He shook his head, leaving the thought unfinished. In the green room, Eastwood stood up suddenly, causing the assistant to jump. Sir, is everything okay? She asked nervously. I think I'd like to go on now, he said quietly. But your segment isn't for another 20 minutes, she protested, looking panicked. Eastwood fixed her with the same steely gaze that had intimidated countless actors and film crews over the decades. I've been in this business since before you were born. Sometimes the schedule changes. Before anyone could stop him, he was moving toward the stage with the determined stride that had carried him through hundreds of film sets. The assistant frantically signaled to the floor director, who looked horrified but could do nothing as Eastwood approached the stage. The audience noticed him first. A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by surprised applause. De Niro, mid-sentence, turned to see what had captured their attention. The color drained from his face as Clint Eastwood walked onto the set. The hosts froze, exchanging alarmed glances. This was not in the script. The lead host recovered first, rising to greet Eastwood with professional warmth. Well, this is an unexpected surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, Clint Eastwood has joined us early. The audience's applause grew louder, many rising to their feet for the Hollywood legend. Eastwood acknowledged them with a nod before turning his attention to De Niro. Hope I'm not interrupting, he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly quality that had delivered countless memorable lines over the years. Heard my name mentioned. Thought I'd join the conversation. De Niro's jaw tightened, but years of acting had taught him how to maintain composure under pressure. He extended his hand, which Eastwood shook firmly. Clint, didn't expect to see you until later. Plans change, Eastwood replied, taking a seat in the empty chair beside De Niro. The lead host, now desperately trying to regain control of her show, jumped in with forced cheerfulness. Well, this is quite the moment. Two of Hollywood's greatest legends together on our stage. I don't think you've ever appeared together on a talk show before, have you? First time for everything, Eastwood said, his eyes never leaving De Niro. The tension in the studio was palpable. Camera operators exchanged nervous glances, while the director in the control room frantically adjusted the shot composition to accommodate the unplanned guest. We were just discussing Robert's new documentary, one host explained to Eastwood, hoping to provide context. Yes, I heard, Eastwood nodded. Sounded like he was about to share some thoughts about me too. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but felt much longer to everyone in the studio. The audience held their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Two titans of American cinema, with fundamentally opposed worldviews, suddenly sharing the stage on live television. What happened next would become one of the most replayed moments in daytime television history. De Niro leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Eastwood. The studio lights seemed to intensify, casting sharp shadows across both men's weathered faces. Two legends of cinema, their combined years in the industry approaching a century, now sat mere feet apart in an unplanned confrontation. "You know, Clint," De Niro began, his voice steady despite the tension, "I've always respected your work. Unforgiven is one of the finest westerns ever made." Eastwood nodded slightly, the faintest hint of appreciation in his eyes. Likewise, Raging Bull showed what dedication to a role really means. The hosts exchanged relieved glances. Perhaps this unexpected meeting wouldn't end in disaster after all. The lead host seized the opportunity to steer the conversation toward safer ground. What a wonderful moment. Two masters of American cinema appreciating each other's work. "Let's talk about your creative processes." "But," De Niro continued, cutting her off, "respecting someone's art doesn't mean agreeing with their politics." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The audience, which had been buzzing with excitement at this unexpected pairing, fell completely silent. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. At 94, he'd mastered the art of the intimidating stare decades ago, and age had done nothing to diminish its effect. "Politics and art are different things," Eastwood replied, his voice low and measured. "Always have been. Always will be." "Are they, though?" De Niro challenged. "The stories we choose to tell, the characters we portray, they reflect our values, don't they?" The show's producer was now frantically signaling from offstage, drawing a finger across her throat in the universal sign to cut the conversation. The lead host tried again. "Perhaps we could focus on your upcoming projects." "Values change," Eastwood said, ignoring the host completely. "What doesn't change is respect for other people's right to see things differently. That's something this country was built on," De Niro scoffed. "Respect has to be earned. When people support policies that harm others—" "That's your opinion," Eastwood interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "And you're entitled to it, just like I'm entitled to mine." The tension was building by the second. The audience watched, transfixed, as these two titans engaged in what was quickly becoming the most unexpected debate in daytime television. Behind the cameras, producers were in a state of panic, torn between the ratings goldmine unfolding and the potential fallout. "This isn't about opinions," De Niro pressed. "Some things are just right or wrong. And who decides that?" Eastwood asked. "You, me? Or do people get to think for themselves?" De Niro leaned forward. "When the facts are clear—" "Facts are rarely clear in politics," Eastwood countered. "That's why reasonable people disagree." The lead host made one more desperate attempt to regain control. "Gentlemen, while this is certainly a fascinating discussion, we have to take a commercial break." Neither man acknowledged her. "The problem," De Niro continued, "is that some disagreements have real consequences for real people. When you supported—" "I've supported what I believed was right," Eastwood said firmly. "Just like you. Difference is, I don't need everyone to agree with me to respect them." The audience was completely silent now, witnessing something raw and unscripted that rarely happens in the carefully controlled world of television. Two men who had spent decades crafting characters were now revealing something of themselves, unfiltered and unplanned. De Niro shook his head. "That sounds nice, but some views shouldn't be respected when they—" "Let me tell you something about respect," Eastwood said, his voice dropping even lower. The microphones barely picked it up, but everyone in the studio leaned forward to catch his words. "I grew up in the Depression. Started working when I was 13. Spent most of my life watching this country change. Some changes were good. Some weren't. But the one thing that's gotten worse is how we talk to each other." De Niro opened his mouth to respond, but something in Eastwood's expression made him pause. "You and I," Eastwood continued, "we're lucky. We get to make films, share our thoughts, and people listen. Most folks don't have that luxury. They just want to live their lives without being told they're bad people because of how they vote." For a moment, the years seemed to weigh heavily on both men. Despite their differences, they shared something few others could understand. The strange journey from unknown actors to cultural icons, and the responsibility that came with it. "The way I see it," De Niro finally replied, his tone slightly softer, "that's exactly why we should speak up." "Because people do listen," Eastwood nodded. They listen, but they don't need us telling them what to think. They need us to show that people can disagree without hating each other. The lead host, sensing a slight easing of tension, tried once more. That's a wonderful sentiment. Perhaps we could, which is why, Eastwood continued, still ignoring her. I didn't appreciate hearing you dismiss my views before I even walked out here. You don't have to agree with me, Bob, but at least have the courtesy to say it to my face. And just like that, the tension returned, thicker than before. De Niro's expression hardened again. I didn't say anything I wouldn't say to your face, he replied. And if you want to have that conversation, I'm ready. The hosts looked at each other in panic. This was spiraling beyond their control. The commercial break was now 3 minutes overdue. Sponsors would be furious, and no one seemed able to rein in these two Hollywood legends. I think we've heard enough, Eastwood said, rising slowly from his chair. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, reminiscent of countless characters he'd portrayed who commanded attention without raising their voice. I came on this show to talk about my book, not to debate politics. Seems like that's all you want to talk about these days, Bob. De Niro stood as well, unwilling to remain seated while Eastwood towered over him. Because politics matters. It affects people's lives. So does common courtesy, Eastwood replied. He turned to the hosts. Ladies, I think I'll wait backstage until my scheduled segment. Seems I was mistaken about joining early. The lead host nodded frantically. Of course, Mr. Eastwood, we'll have someone escort you. I know the way, he said. Then turning back to De Niro, he added, Good seeing you, Bob. Congratulations on the documentary. The words were polite, but the tone was unmistakable. This conversation wasn't over, merely postponed. As Eastwood walked off stage, the audience remained silent, unsure whether to applaud or stay quiet. The unusual tension had left everyone uncertain about proper protocol. The floor director finally signaled for applause, and a hesitant clapping began. De Niro remained standing, watching Eastwood's exit with a mixture of frustration and something like respect. When he finally sat down, he seemed somehow diminished, as if the brief confrontation had taken more out of him than he'd expected. Well, the lead host said, forcing a bright smile, that was certainly an unexpected moment. We'll be right back after this break. As the cameras cut away, chaos erupted backstage. Production assistants scrambled to ensure Eastwood and De Niro remained separated. The show's executive producer was already on the phone with network executives, trying to explain the unplanned confrontation. In his dressing room, Eastwood sat quietly, showing no outward sign of the tension that had just occurred. His assistant hovered nervously by the door. Should I call the car around, Mr. Eastwood? If you'd prefer not to continue with the show. Eastwood shook his head. I made a commitment. I'll keep it. Meanwhile, De Niro remained on set during the commercial break, declining offers to return to his dressing room. One of the hosts approached him cautiously. Robert, are you okay? That was intense. De Niro nodded. I'm fine. Just surprised. Didn't expect him to walk out like that? Neither did we, she admitted. The segment with both of you is getting a lot of attention already. Social media is blowing up. De Niro didn't seem particularly interested in this news. His mind was elsewhere, perhaps replaying the encounter, thinking of things he should have said differently. In the control room, the director was frantically reworking the show's remaining segments. We need to keep them separated for the rest of the show. De Niro can finish his interview, then we'll have the cooking segment, then Eastwood. Buffer them with something neutral. De Niro was supposed to be done already, his assistant pointed out. His car is waiting. Ask him to stay, the director replied. After what just happened, we need a proper conclusion. Can't just leave it hanging like that. Back on set as the commercial break neared its end, the lead host leaned toward De Niro. We're back in 30 seconds. Would you mind staying for the rest of your segment? We didn't get to cover your documentary properly. De Niro hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But I want to be clear about something. I don't have any personal issue with Eastwood. It's about principles. Of course, she said quickly. We completely understand. As the countdown to return from commercial reached its final seconds, none of them realized that Clint Eastwood had made a decision of his own. A decision that would turn this already unexpected encounter into one of the most memorable moments in television history. The red light on the camera blinked back to life. The commercial break was over, and millions of viewers who had been watching the unexpected confrontation between two Hollywood giants were now eagerly waiting to see what would happen next. Social media was already exploding with clips of the tense exchange, spreading faster than the producers could track. "Welcome back to The View," the lead host said with practiced composure that barely masked her anxiety. "We're continuing our conversation with Robert De Niro about his new documentary." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she looked past the cameras. The other hosts followed her gaze, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. De Niro, sensing something behind him, turned in his chair. Clint Eastwood was walking back onto the set. The floor director frantically waved his arms, signaling for anyone to intervene, but the crew stood frozen, unwilling to physically stop the 94-year-old legend. Eastwood moved with purpose, his tall frame still commanding despite his age. "Ladies," he nodded to the hosts as he approached. "Bob," he acknowledged De Niro. The lead host recovered first. "Mr. Eastwood, your segment is scheduled after—" "I know," Eastwood said simply, "but I'm here now." Without waiting for permission, he sat down in the empty chair next to De Niro. The two men faced each other, neither showing any intention of backing down. The audience held its breath, collectively sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I thought about what you said," Eastwood continued, addressing De Niro directly, "about speaking up because people listen to us. You're right about that part." De Niro's surprise was visible, but he remained guarded. "Glad we agree on something." "We probably agree on more than you think," Eastwood replied. "Just express it differently." The hosts exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to interrupt or let this unexpected moment play out. The producer was making frantic cutting motions from offstage, but no one was looking her way anymore. All eyes were fixed on the two men. "Look," Eastwood continued, his voice low and measured, "I didn't come back out here to argue politics. I came because walking off like that wasn't right. Not how I do things. I've spent 7 decades in this business, built a reputation on finishing what I start." De Niro studied him for a long moment before responding. "I respect that." "So," Eastwood said, turning to include the hosts in the conversation, "I thought instead of 2 separate segments, why not have one? 2 old actors who've seen plenty of changes in this industry and this country might be more interesting than hearing us separately." The lead host's expression transformed from panic to delight. This potential disaster was turning into ratings gold. "That's a wonderful idea, Mr. Eastwood. We'd be honored to host both of you together." De Niro's expression remained cautious. "As long as we can have an honest conversation." "Always been my preference," Eastwood replied with the hint of a smile. The tension in the studio shifted, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something more complex. A kind of wary respect between 2 men who had spent decades at the top of their profession, approaching it from very different angles. "Well then," the lead host said, seizing the opportunity, "let's begin with something you both share, a love for filmmaking. Robert, you've directed 9 films. Clint, you've directed over 40. How has your approach to directing changed over the years?" It was a safe question, designed to establish common ground, and both men responded with thoughtful reflections on their craft. The audience watched as these 2 icons discussed the evolution of filmmaking, from shooting on film to digital technology, from studio-dominated systems to more independent productions. "The tools change," Eastwood observed, "but the storytelling doesn't. Always comes down to finding truth in a moment." De Niro nodded in agreement. "That's where we probably have the most in common, searching for that truth, whether as actors or directors." For the next 15 minutes, the conversation flowed naturally between topics related to their craft. The host skillfully kept the discussion centered on film, and the audience was treated to insights from nearly a century of combined experience. Both men seemed to relax slightly, finding familiar territory in their shared profession. Then one of the hosts decided to take a risk. "You've both portrayed characters with strong moral codes but very different perspectives. Dirty Harry and Travis Bickle come to mind. Do you think those characters reflect something about your own worldviews?" The question hovered dangerously close to the political territory they'd been carefully avoiding. The studio grew quiet again, the brief comfort of discussing craft giving way to renewed tension. Eastwood answered first. "Characters aren't political statements. They're human beings, complicated and flawed. Dirty Harry wasn't about politics. He was about a man trying to do what he thought was right in a system that got in his way. De Niro nodded slowly. Travis Bickle wasn't a hero. He was disturbed, looking for meaning in a world that confused him. If anything, he was a warning about what happens when someone gets lost in their own worldview. But, the host pressed, many people have interpreted those characters through political lenses over the years. Not our problem, Eastwood said flatly. Once a film is out there, people see what they want to see. Politics included. That's true, De Niro conceded. But creators have responsibilities too. The stories we choose to tell matter. The conversation was veering back toward their earlier confrontation. The lead host prepared to intervene, but Eastwood spoke first. "Let me ask you something, Bob," he said, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "When did acting and directing stop being enough? When did you decide you needed to speak out politically?" It was a genuine question, without the edge their earlier exchange had carried. De Niro seemed to recognize this shift, considering his answer carefully. "It wasn't one moment," he finally replied. "Over time, I started feeling that staying silent was a choice too. That not speaking up was its own kind of statement." Eastwood nodded thoughtfully. "For me, it's always been about the work. Let that speak for itself. But is that enough anymore?" De Niro challenged, though his tone remained respectful. "In today's world, with everything that's happening, maybe not," Eastwood acknowledged. "But there's a difference between speaking up and lecturing people. Most folks don't want to be told what to think by actors." The conversation had found a new rhythm, still touching on their fundamental differences, but without the hostility of their earlier exchange. The audience watched, captivated as these two men navigated the complex territory between their shared profession and divergent perspectives. "I don't tell people what to think," De Niro clarified. "I tell them what I think." "There's a difference." "Fair enough," Eastwood conceded. Then, with a hint of his trademark dry humor, he added, "Though you do tend to say it pretty forcefully." For the first time since Eastwood had walked onto the set, De Niro smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Says the man who made a career playing characters who speak in one-liners with a .44 Magnum for emphasis. The audience laughed, relieved by the break in tension. Even Eastwood chuckled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Touché," he said. The hosts, sensing the shift in atmosphere, skillfully guided the conversation toward a discussion of their current projects. De Niro spoke about his documentary with passion, but without the defensive edge he'd shown earlier. Eastwood listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about the filmmaking process. When it came time to discuss Eastwood's book, De Niro returned the courtesy, engaging with Eastwood's reflections on his career with respectful attention. The audience watched in amazement as what had begun as a tense confrontation evolved into something approaching a masterclass from two cinematic legends. As their joint segment neared its end, the lead host asked one final question. "What do you admire most about each other as artists?" Eastwood considered for a moment. "Bob's commitment," he said finally. "Never takes the easy road. Always pushes himself in the audience. Even when I disagree with the message, I respect the craftsmanship." De Niro nodded in appreciation before offering his own answer. "Clint's honesty," he said. "On screen and off. No pretense, no hiding behind technique. Just truth, whether you like it or not." The lead host beamed at this perfect television moment. Two icons finding common ground despite their differences. "Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you both for joining us today for what has certainly been one of our most memorable shows ever." As the camera prepared to cut away, Eastwood turned to De Niro. "Dinner sometime? Without the cameras?" De Niro looked surprised but nodded. "I'd like that." The red light on the camera blinked off, signaling the end of the segment. The audience erupted into enthusiastic applause, many rising to their feet in standing ovation. What had started as an accidental confrontation had transformed into something unexpected, a model for how two people with fundamentally different perspectives might still find a way to engage with respect. Backstage, however, the mood was shifting rapidly. The show's producer approached the hosts with a phone in her hand, her expression grave. "We have a problem," she said quietly. "The network is not happy with what just happened." The lead host frowned. "What are you talking about?" "That was incredible television." "Yes?" the producer agreed. "But it wasn't the approved content. They're saying we allowed political discourse that wasn't balanced or controlled." The calls are already coming in from stakeholders. As De Niro and Eastwood made their way backstage, neither aware of the brewing storm, a network executive was walking briskly toward the studio, determination in every step. What had seemed like a perfect resolution was about to take yet another unexpected turn. The network executive stormed through the backstage area, his expensive suit and purposeful stride causing staff members to step quickly out of his way. At 52, Thomas Wilson had spent 3 decades climbing the corporate ladder, and his position as Senior Vice President of Daytime Programming gave him considerable power over shows like The View. "Where are they?" he demanded, not bothering with greetings as he approached the show's producer. "De Niro is in the green room." "Eastwood is in his dressing room," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thomas, I know it wasn't the planned segment, but the audience loved it. Social media is exploding. We're trending #1 nationwide." Wilson's expression remained cold. "I don't care if we're trending on Mars. That was not the approved content. We have advertisers calling us already, threatening to pull out." "Pull out? Why?" "There wasn't anything controversial." "It's not about what was said," Wilson interrupted. "It's about what wasn't said. We promised advertisers a balanced show with multiple perspectives. Instead, we got 2 Hollywood liberals patting each other on the back." The producer frowned. "Eastwood isn't exactly liberal. Doesn't matter. The perception is what counts. And right now the perception is that we allowed our platform to be hijacked." Wilson straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of tense meetings. "Where's the green room? I need to speak with them." In the green room, De Niro sat quietly, scrolling through messages on his phone. Despite his calm exterior, he felt strangely energized by the exchange with Eastwood. It had been years since he'd had such an honest conversation on television, one that wasn't just sound bites and prepared statements. His assistant approached cautiously. "Robert, your car is still waiting. We should leave soon if you want to make your next appointment." De Niro nodded but made no move to get up. "Give me a few more minutes." Down the hallway, Eastwood was already preparing to leave. At his age, he carefully managed his energy, and the morning's unexpected confrontation had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. His longtime assistant helped him into his jacket. "That went better than expected," Eastwood remarked, his tone dry. "Certainly more interesting than the usual book promotion," his assistant replied with a smile. "The car is ready whenever you are, sir." Eastwood nodded, then paused. "Has De Niro left yet?" "I don't think so. His car is still out front." Eastwood seemed to consider something. "I meant what I said about dinner." His assistant raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In 30 years of working with Eastwood, she'd learned when questions were welcome and when they weren't. Before either man could leave, there was a sharp knock at both of their doors. Production assistants entered almost simultaneously, their expressions tense. "Mr. Eastwood, Mr. De Niro, your presence is requested in the executive conference room." "Immediately." De Niro frowned. "What's this about?" "Network executives want to speak with both of you," the assistant explained, clearly uncomfortable with the task. "It's urgent." 5 minutes later, De Niro and Eastwood found themselves in a sleek conference room on the upper floor of the building. The view of Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows would normally have been impressive, but the atmosphere inside was too tense for sightseeing. Thomas Wilson sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 other executives and the show's producer, who looked pale. De Niro and Eastwood sat across from each other, both radiating the quiet confidence of men who had spent decades dealing with studio power players. "Gentlemen," Wilson began, his tone carefully neutral, "thank you for joining us. I'll be direct. What happened on stage today was not the approved content for our show." De Niro glanced at Eastwood, then back to Wilson. "It was unplanned, yes, but the audience seemed to appreciate it." "The audience isn't who pays the bills," Wilson replied coldly. "Our advertisers do, and several of them have expressed serious concerns about the nature of your discussion." Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly were these concerns?" Wilson shifted in his chair. "The network has a strict policy regarding political content. All viewpoints must be given equal time and representation. Your segment failed to provide balance." "Balance?" De Niro repeated incredulously. "We barely touched politics. We mostly talked about filmmaking." "The subtext was clear," Wilson insisted, "and given both your public personas, the message sent to our viewers was one-sided." Eastwood leaned forward slightly. Seems to me the message was that two people with different views can have a civil conversation. Thought that was something worth showing these days. The room fell silent. Wilson seemed momentarily at a loss for words, but quickly recovered. Nevertheless, the network has decided that we need to take immediate action to address the situation. We're planning to issue a statement clarifying that your views don't represent the network's position. Additionally, we're considering editing the segment before it appears online or in reruns. Editing? De Niro's voice had that dangerous quietness his co-stars had learned to recognize over the years. You want to censor a conversation that already aired live to millions of people? Not censor, Wilson corrected quickly. Edit for time and clarity. Sounds like censorship to me, Eastwood remarked, his expression unreadable. Wilson sighed. Gentlemen, I understand this is uncomfortable, but— No, Eastwood interrupted, his voice firm but not loud. You don't understand. I've been in this business since before you were born. Seen studios try to control narratives, silence voices, manipulate meanings. Always ends badly. Mr. Eastwood, Wilson began. But Eastwood wasn't finished. What happened out there today was real. Authentic. Two people with different perspectives finding common ground. Isn't that what television should be about? De Niro nodded in agreement. If you're worried about balance, then have us back. Invite someone with opposing views. But don't edit what's already happened. The show's producer, who had been silent until now, saw an opening. That's actually a great idea. We could do a follow-up segment next week. Frame it as a continuation of the conversation. Wilson frowned. That doesn't solve our immediate problem. Your immediate problem, Eastwood said quietly, is that you're about to make a much bigger one. You edit that segment and I'll make sure every major news outlet knows about it. De Niro leaned forward. Same here. And I'll be very specific about which advertisers complained. The threat hung in the air. Both men had enough influence and media connections to create a PR nightmare, far worse than anything the network was currently facing. Wilson looked from one legend to the other, recognizing the impossible position he was in. His phone buzzed on the table, another executive calling, no doubt wanting updates. He ignored it. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. De Niro and Eastwood exchanged glances. Despite their decades in the industry, they had never worked together, never collaborated on a project. Yet in this moment, they found themselves united against a common adversary. Air the segment unedited, De Niro stated firmly. Release the full version online. Let people see what actually happened. And in return? Wilson asked. In return, Eastwood said, we'll both come back for a follow-up. Make it a special if you want. 2 nights more in-depth conversation. Bring in others with different perspectives. Make it about finding common ground in divided times. Wilson blinked in surprise. The offer was unexpected and potentially extremely valuable. A special featuring both Eastwood and De Niro would be a ratings windfall. That could work, he said slowly. But I'd need commitments from both of you in writing. And final approval on the format. You'll get the commitments, De Niro said, but the conversation stays authentic. No pre-approved questions, no scripted responses. Wilson hesitated, clearly calculating the risks versus rewards. Finally, he nodded. I'll take it to the board, but I think we can make this work. As the meeting wrapped up, De Niro and Eastwood found themselves walking toward the elevator together. Neither spoke until they were alone in the hallway. Didn't expect to be negotiating a TV deal today, De Niro remarked. Eastwood's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Been a while since I had to strong-arm a network exec. You still got it, De Niro acknowledged. Then after a brief pause, you serious about that follow-up special? Why not? Eastwood shrugged. Might be interesting. Could even do some good. The elevator arrived, its doors sliding open silently. Before stepping in, Eastwood turned to De Niro. That dinner offer still stands. Might be good to talk through what we're getting ourselves into. De Niro nodded. My schedule's tight this week, but I could do next Tuesday. Tuesday works, Eastwood agreed. I know a place in Tribeca, quiet, no cameras. As they descended to the ground floor, both men stood in comfortable silence, processing the morning's unexpected events. What had begun as an accidental confrontation had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a potential collaboration between two artists, whose paths had run parallel for decades without ever truly intersecting. In the lobby, they parted ways with a simple handshake. each heading to their respective cars. News crews had already gathered outside the building, alerted by social media to the historic joint appearance. The show's publicist was frantically trying to organize an impromptu press conference. Neither man stopped for the cameras. Their unexpected alliance had not been formed for publicity, and whatever came next would happen on their terms, not the media's. Back in the conference room, Wilson was already on the phone with network executives, pitching the special that had been thrust upon him. Despite his earlier resistance, he now spoke with enthusiasm about a historic television event and bridging America's cultural divide. The show's producer watched from across the room, a mixture of relief and amazement on her face. Somehow, what had begun as a potential disaster had transformed into the opportunity of a lifetime, all because two stubborn legends had refused to back down. As the day wore on, clips of the unplanned segment spread across social media, generating millions of views and thousands of comments. What viewers saw was something increasingly rare in American media. Two people with fundamentally different worldviews engaging with genuine respect and finding common ground without compromising their principles. What they didn't see yet was the behind-the-scenes power play that had protected that rare moment of authenticity from corporate sanitization. That story would come later when De Niro and Eastwood sat down for their promised special, ready to show America that civil discourse wasn't dead after all. But first, they had a dinner to attend. Two legends, one table, no cameras. The real conversation was just beginning. The restaurant Eastwood had chosen was tucked away on a quiet Tribeca side street, an unassuming place with no flashy sign or red carpet entrance. Inside, the lighting was warm but dim, the wood-paneled walls lined with black and white photographs documenting New York's rich history. It was the kind of establishment that had weathered decades of changing trends without compromising its identity. De Niro arrived first, 10 minutes early as was his habit. The maitre d' recognized him immediately, but maintained professional composure, leading him to a private corner booth shielded from the main dining area by an elegant wooden partition. Mr. Eastwood called ahead to request this table, the maitre d' explained. He should be arriving shortly. Would you care for a drink while you wait? De Niro ordered a simple scotch, neat, then settled into the comfortable booth. He found himself surprisingly nervous about this dinner, an unfamiliar feeling for a man who had spent decades in the spotlight. Their impromptu collaboration on The View had generated more attention than either of them had anticipated. The special they'd proposed to the network was now officially in development, with a tentative air date just 3 weeks away. The bell above the restaurant door chimed softly, and De Niro looked up to see Eastwood enter. Even at 94, the man carried himself with unmistakable presence. Several diners glanced up, doing double takes as they recognized him, but quickly returned to their meals. This was New York, after all, where celebrity sightings were treated with deliberate nonchalance. Eastwood made his way to the booth with unhurried confidence. De Niro stood to greet him, and the two men shook hands firmly before sitting down across from each other. "Hope I didn't keep you waiting," Eastwood said, though he was precisely on time. "Just got here myself," De Niro replied, the small social lie coming easily. There was a momentary silence as the waiter approached, took Eastwood's drink order, a simple mineral water, and handed them menus. Both men studied the options with the careful attention they typically reserved for scripts. "Been coming here since the 70s, Eastwood remarked. "One of the few places in New York that hasn't changed." De Niro nodded appreciatively. "Know what you mean. Hard to find places with history anymore. Everything gets torn down, rebuilt, reimagined. Not always for the better," Eastwood added. "No," De Niro agreed. "Not always." The simple exchange seemed to ease the initial tension. They placed their orders, steak for Eastwood, fish for De Niro, and settled into more comfortable postures. The restaurant's quiet ambiance enveloped them, offering a rare privacy that both men valued. "Quite a week," De Niro said finally. "Didn't expect our little impromptu chat to cause such a stir." "Media always hungry for something new," Eastwood replied with a slight shrug. "Two old warhorses like us finding common ground makes for good headlines, I guess." "Better than the alternative," De Niro acknowledged with a wry smile. Eastwood took a sip of his water. "You know, I've been thinking about this special they want us to do. Could be something worthwhile if we do it right." De Niro leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What are you thinking?" "Something more than just another talk show," Eastwood said. "Something with substance. Real conversation, not just sound bites and talking points. Like a dialogue rather than a debate," De Niro suggested, warming to the idea. Eastwood nodded. "Exactly. Everyone's shouting these days. Nobody's listening." Their food arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. Both men began eating with the focused appreciation of people who had learned over long lives not to rush through meals. After a few minutes, De Niro spoke again. "The network's going to want drama, conflict, that's what sells." "Let them want it," Eastwood replied simply. "Doesn't mean we have to give it to them." De Niro smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I like your thinking. But how do we make that work?" They're already lining up other guests, political commentators from both sides. "We set the tone," Eastwood said. "Lead by example. Show them it's possible to disagree without demonizing." De Niro considered this as he took another bite of his fish. Might be easier said than done, depending on who they bring in. "Maybe," Eastwood acknowledged. "But worth trying, isn't it?" The question hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation. Despite their different perspectives, both men had arrived at a similar conclusion. The current state of public discourse was broken, and perhaps they were in a unique position to demonstrate an alternative. "You know," De Niro said after a thoughtful pause, "we could suggest some ground rules for the special. No interrupting, no personal attacks. Focus on ideas, not individuals." "Good start," Eastwood agreed. "And no prepared statements. Keep it authentic." As they continued their meal, the conversation flowed more naturally. They discussed the current state of Hollywood, sharing observations about how the industry had changed over their long careers. They found common ground in their love for the craft of filmmaking and their frustration with the business aspects that often undermined artistic integrity. "Ever regret not doing a film?" De Niro asked at one point. Eastwood considered the question. "Few times. Turned down Superman back in the 70s. Probably for the best," he added with a hint of self-deprecating humor. "Wouldn't have pictured you in tights," De Niro agreed with a chuckle. "How about you? Any roles you wish you'd taken?" De Niro shook his head. "Not taken, no. But there are a few I wish I'd approached differently. Always second-guessing even after all these years." "That's what makes you good," Eastwood observed. "Never being completely satisfied." By the time they'd finished their main courses, the initial awkwardness had completely dissolved. There was something refreshingly simple about their interaction. Two men who had lived through similar eras from different vantage points, finding unexpected common ground in their shared experiences. When the waiter came to clear their plates, Eastwood declined dessert but ordered coffee. De Niro did the same. As they waited for their coffee to arrive, Eastwood steered the conversation back to the upcoming special. "Been thinking about something else for this show," he said. "What if we don't just talk about finding common ground? What if we actually do something concrete?" De Niro raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "Some kind of joint project. Something that brings people together across the divide." "Like what?" "A film," Eastwood shook his head. Was thinking something more direct. "A foundation, maybe, supporting programs that teach civil discourse in schools, or funding community projects that require people with different perspectives to work together." De Niro's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine interest. "That could actually make a difference. Something beyond just talk." "Exactly," Eastwood said. "Use our names, our influence to create something lasting." The coffee arrived, and both men fell silent as they added cream or sugar according to their preferences. De Niro stirred his cup thoughtfully before speaking again. "You know, when I walked into the studio that day, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Life's full of surprises," Eastwood replied. "Gets more interesting when you stop trying to predict everything." De Niro nodded in agreement. "So this foundation idea, you serious about it?" "Wouldn't have mentioned it if I wasn't," Eastwood said simply. "Would take a lot of work. Planning, organization, legal structures. Got people who can handle that part," Eastwood noted. "Question is whether you're interested." De Niro didn't hesitate. "I'm in. But we'd need to be clear about the mission. Make sure it truly represents both our perspectives." "That's the whole point," Eastwood said. "Show people it's possible to work together despite differences." As they continued discussing the potential foundation, sketching out broad ideas on napkins and debating possible approaches. Both men seemed energized by the possibility of creating something meaningful. Their conversation moved beyond politics to deeper questions about citizenship, community, and the future of a country they both loved deeply, even if they envisioned different paths forward. By the time they asked for the check, which Eastwood insisted on paying, pointing out that he had chosen the restaurant, 3 hours had passed. The restaurant had gradually emptied around them, the staff discreetly going about their closing routines without rushing the famous diners. Outside, the New York night was cool and clear, the city's endless symphony of sounds providing a familiar backdrop. Their cars waited at opposite ends of the block, drivers patiently standing by. "Good talk," Eastwood said simply as they prepared to part ways. "Very good," De Niro agreed. "Productive." They shook hands again, this time with the warmth of new collaborators rather than the cautious respect of former adversaries. "I'll have my people send over some preliminary ideas for the foundation," Eastwood said. "And we should touch base about the special next week. Make sure we're on the same page before meeting with the network." De Niro nodded. "Sounds like a plan. Looking forward to it." As they turned toward their respective cars, De Niro paused. "You know, the media's going to have a field day with this. Eastwood and De Niro, Hollywood's odd couple." Eastwood's mouth quirked in his characteristic half-smile. "Let them talk. We've got work to do." 3 weeks later, Finding Common Ground, a conversation with Eastwood and De Niro, aired as a 2-night television event. The network, initially skeptical about the format the two legends had insisted upon, was stunned by the ratings, the highest for a non-sports program in 5 years. What viewers witnessed wasn't the shouting match or tense debate many had expected. Instead, they saw two men with fundamentally different worldviews demonstrating that it was possible to discuss complex issues with both passion and respect. The other guests, initially primed for conflict, found themselves following the example set by the hosts. The announcement of the Eastwood-De Niro Foundation for Civic Dialogue at the end of the second night generated immediate attention. By morning, donations were pouring in from across the political spectrum, and requests for the program in schools and communities nationwide overwhelmed the foundation's newly established website. What had begun as an accidental confrontation on a daytime talk show had evolved into something neither man could have anticipated, a partnership that transcended politics and reminded a divided nation of the power of authentic conversation. As one prominent commentator observed the following day, in an era of carefully constructed social media personas and poll-tested talking points, Eastwood and De Niro offered something revolutionary: genuine dialogue between people who disagree but refuse to be enemies. Perhaps there's a lesson there for all of us.